us your name.
I'm Bernard Casey. I work at the University of Warwick in the UK, but I used to work for a while at the OECD in Paris, and I actually live some of my time in Germany, and I spend a lot of my time engaged in international comparative research and advisory work to public bodies, governments, as well as contributing to academic development.
Okay. What would you say is commonly understood as long-term care in the countries in which you've worked? If you can give us sort of a profile for each country that you want to explain.
In some cases it's much more formalised than in others, but basically I understand it with respect to older people. I know it can cover younger people. My interest has been primarily with what are sometimes called the frail elderly, so it is the provision of services and assistance to these, either by their families, friends, neighbours, or by services which are provided in some way by a public authority or financed by a public authority, or in some cases services which they finance themselves out of their own pockets, or very occasionally, depending on where you are, from an insurance policy which you might have got. That is very different, and the mix of these, the mix of care technologies for any one individual and in any one country is vastly different. Although, one of the things which I find interesting is, despite the prima facie differences between countries, the role of the family is extraordinarily important, and the role of informal care is extraordinarily important in almost all of them. And in fact, some of the obligations which people have or feel are very similar across countries. They're not only very similar, but often they are things which are codified and are actually built into the programmes that persist and exist in various countries, and interestingly enough, also in countries where they do not prima facie exist or do not appear to exist, they are being pushed in increasingly by reformers as one of the ways in which you justify reducing services which you can no longer afford as public provision. On the flip side of that, of course, if you go to Southeast Asia, people are busy having to establish more formal systems of provision, precisely because of movements of populations, industrialisation, female labour force participation, all the things that we know about greater geographical distances between people. There is a recognition of the fact that we need to deal with what is now a new social risk, and we now have to socialise provision for this. And then there are people in those countries who sit around and wring their hands and say, yes, but we are undermining our traditional values. So, kind of, on the one hand, they're going in one direction, whereas in many European countries, including the UK, there is this kind of reference explicitly, or sometimes it is explicit, to Asian values, and if only we had more Asian values, then families would look after people, and therefore the state would need to do less.
Great. Okay. So, what do you think the sort of pressing policy priorities are for both Germany and the UK in terms of long-term care? Maybe the top three.
Well, I think one of the things is that we have failed actually to recognise some of the costs that are associated with societal ageing. We actually have got some fairly good view about future costs with respect to the paying of pensions. We kind of know what we think we're likely to pay. We're actually very much less clear about what we really know about what we are paying for long-term care and what is going to be involved in this. And one of the things which I did some years ago now, but developed out of some work that I was doing at OECD, and this was when the care costs analysis was very much less developed than it is now, is that what you could see was that the rate of growth of expenditure was greater with respect to care than it was with respect to pensions, the thing which people were actually getting very concerned about. And in fact, in my view, it might well be the case that the costs of physical dependency are going to far outweigh the costs of financial dependency associated with old age.
Okay, interesting. And do you get a sense that the current financial crisis is having an impact on long-term care provided, perhaps in the UK and Germany?
Oh yes, I mean it is the case in. Well, we've seen what's happened with respect to the response to the Dilmot Commission, and none of that is surprising. We see this in the way in which discussions about private insurance is being reintroduced in Germany. We see that, I mean, in Germany, the costs, the allowances that you get for relative to the level of need which you have been effectively frozen ever since the long-term care insurance system was introduced, which means that people are having to dig in their pockets in any case more and more. That in itself is interesting. You look at Japan, and I mentioned this in my talk, that the long-term care insurance system there, faced with fiscal constraints, is having to readapt itself. I mean, is putting more emphasis on what it calls prevention, which actually prevents and stops long-term care workers from doing certain things for their clients which in the past they used to do. And it's pushed back to them, because it's supposed to be good for them to engage in these activities and help themselves a bit, and it also means that it's pushed back onto families. So yes, the fiscal crisis has enormous implications, and since the fiscal crisis is going to be with us for a very long time, I do not see the kind of changes that we need coming through. I think we have really got to understand, and we do not understand properly, or we are not prepared to talk about the real costs of ageing societies, and in particular the real costs of the growth of the very old, who tend to be the very frail.
Okay, great summary. If you had the opportunity to introduce one new policy reform, what would it be and why and where?
I don't think it has to be. I've been interested in the last time, and I was talking at the conference about the workforce of the care sector. I think the workforce of the care sector is very poorly organised. I don't mean trade union organised, I mean the way in which tasks are done, the status of the people who are doing it, the way in which jobs are put together. So with respect to the labour force and how things are badly organised and what the low status of people is, perhaps unusual, I mean, I don't know if I was the only person, but I must have been one of the very few people in this conference who'd actually been a recipient of care recently. I spent 6 months last year, beginning of this year, in hospital, and then spent about 3 months at home subsequently as a recipient of care services, which were provided primarily out of my own pocket and to some extent by private insurance. And I actually saw the way in which these people were obliged to work, how they were paid, how they were scheduled, what was expected of them, what their training was or what it wasn't, what they actually had to contribute themselves. I mean, you know, they don't even get training paid for by their employer very often. That has to be done in their own time. The fees have to be paid for. And so I think there is great importance in enhancing the status of these workers, redesigning the jobs that they do, improving the technology. I think that it could be a much superior job and a much better paid job and a much higher status job. I think one of the things that one needs to take account of is that now, if you look after small children, you are required to have quite a lot of qualifications to do that. That if you look after very old people, there's actually almost no requirement for any qualifications whatsoever or any training whatsoever.
That's interesting. So in your view, what is the most important piece of evidence that we need in order to inform policy changes in long-term care?
We actually know almost nothing. It was Charles Norman who said, the problem with Ireland is we don't kind of know what's going on, and we have no data. We don't have data sets which allow us to join people together. That is not peculiar to Ireland. We actually know very little about who's getting what, how, when, from whom, where, whether it is adequate, whether it is superfluous in some cases, and about that. So there is a great open area there, and I think that authorities which should be taking care needs and the needs of this growing section of the population, growing numbers of the population, really do have to invest an awful lot more in really finding out what is going on. I hope I don't sound just like a researcher who says there is need for more research, but I think it is pitiful what we have got.
That's interesting. Yeah. What policy priority is allocated to long-term care in Germany, Japan, and the UK?
Lowish to medium in Germany, lowish to medium in Japan, and they would like to put as low a priority onto it as they possibly can in the UK, but possibly certain pressures will not allow them to.
Okay. And how aware is the general public about what the long-term care system offers to people in need of care in those same three countries?
Well, let's take the UK. I mean, there is this view that you're going to lose your house. Actually, if you look at the numbers of people who lose their house, it's not very great. That's thing one. Thing two is that you don't lose your house. You only lose your house if there is nobody else living in it. Your wife or your husband is not going to be dispossessed because you have gone into care. So people don't know, people don't even know that. And I mean, a lot of policy is actually being made in the UK around this fear that people are going to lose their houses. Now, what I would say, and this is what I think is also important, is that this is almost a one cohort only is ever actually having this huge, great, big housing wealth which somehow is going to be picked upon to pay for care. One's own parents did not have that. These people of my age's parents did not have that. As an economist, I am thoroughly opposed to what are called intergenerational transfers, passing things on down. As an economist, it's actually shown to be very inefficient. I mean, inheritors don't tend to make very good use of what they get. If you taxed inheritance, which I would actually be all in favour of, you're doing what is effectively a lump sum taxation. So that has no impact upon incentives. This is why people don't like taxes, because taxes affect incentives. There's no incentive which is being interfered with as well. And I think one also needs to bear in mind that the people who are actually making such a fuss about getting or not getting this inheritance, you actually get it very late in life. You get it so late in life, you've actually, if you're in the house buying, which is the biggest cost, you've probably paid off your house by the time your parents have died. Probably you've even got your kids through university, even with the high fees that you're now having to pay. So this thing comes to you very late in life and effectively finances a very cushy old age, which you never actually even expected to have, because all your working life you hadn't realised how much your parents' house value would increase. So I'm all in favour of taxing very vigorously this. I actually think, intergenerational transfers have certain analogies to sort of welfare payments. I mean, people are criticised for being welfare dependent. I don't think they ought to be inheritance dependent either.
No, interesting. How well do you think the system supports people with long-term care needs? Just a single digit for maybe Germany, Japan and the UK.
Not very well.
Not
any
very
of
well.
them. And I don't think it does it vastly better in those countries which supposedly have set up things like long-term care insurance schemes to help cover some of those costs. In fact, because these schemes will be too expensive to really cover everything, and in fact don't cover. One of the things about Germany, which is actually very important, is that until very recently, dementia, which is the biggest problem, was not a condition per se which entitled a person to draw upon the long-term care insurance to support them. You could only get it if you had something else, and you'd get it without something else. The fact there was dementia there meant that you were getting something, but you didn't get it because of the dementia.
Okay. And how well do you think systems support carers?
I know less about this, I must admit, but I mean, one gets the impression that it is that informal carers put in an awful lot, and an awful lot is expected of them. Actually, I mean, if we talk about formal carers, I mean, I think formal carers get a pretty rough edge. I mean, their jobs are very bad, their working conditions are very bad, and so there have been plenty of people who've been talking at this conference about problems encountered by formal carers, and there have been plenty being telling us about the problems encountered by informal carers.
Okay, right. And how integrated do you think health and social care systems or policies or services are
extremely
in these countries?
Extremely poorly. And I mean, again, we heard about this. It is not UK specific. I mean, it is the countries in which I have been doing work and been doing research. You hear exactly the same problems, and it is a very unclear. Even I am now wondering whether there were some things which my insurance didn't pay for, which I wonder whether in fact I would not be entitled to claim off the UK health service because I needed that care for a health condition. I was discharged from hospital. I came out of hospital. I had a health condition. I couldn't do certain things. My private insurance decided that it couldn't pay for that, and I just wonder whether the public authorities might not actually have an obligation to do so. But the amount of work that I would probably have to do to actually convince them of this would probably drive me up the wall, and I really probably got better things and I can probably afford to forget it.
All right, thanks very much. It was great speaking with you.
Thank you.